In this class, I'm going to talk about economics, as you can see. I'm going to talk about the definitions of economics, or in particular, one definition. But let's run through it and see what economics is about. Let's assume this is the first time you've encountered economics. I'm going to look at three definitions, but in truth, I'm actually going to look at one. The three definitions I've lined up are these, and I'm going to specialize in the number three, the Robbins definition. But the first two are by very famous economists, and we'll just put their definitions up so we have something to contrast with. Robbins is a much more detailed definition. We'll start with Kennan's definition. The study of things having to do with man's material welfare. In a way, that's a lovely definition. It doesn't tell us very much. Man's material welfare. What is that exactly? How do we define man's material welfare? And the study of things. What things? I mean, it's vague. I understand the definition. Having said that, it's in English. That's understandable. It's the study of things to do with man's material welfare. It's a throwaway comment, but it's not a good definition. It doesn't tell us what the subject is about. So we'll leave that. We're not sure what man materials welfare is and the study of things. It's too vague. Marshall is a really big name in economics. Marshall gave us our understanding of the market and how the market works, supply and demand, and lots of contributions to economics. But Marshall's definition is the study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. The study of mankind in the ordinary business of... What is the ordinary business of life? What does that mean? Again, we're not sure. It's ordinary business of life. It's too vague. So it's not a useful definition. It's a definition we could, just as a throwaway definition, a bit like Kennan's definition earlier. It's good, but it doesn't tell us what ordinary business of life is. So it's not a complete definition. And here's a bonus one I've just thrown in. Economics is the science of the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Well, Adam Smith wrote a book, a very famous book called The Wealth of Nations. So clearly he's going to align economics with that, which is what it was about, of course. But again, it doesn't tell us anything. But that's a definition. And on the subject of definitions, I'm giving you this. I'm not going to read through it. I'd ask you to go back over, stop the video and read it yourself and make notes of it. It's essentially what I've been saying. I've introduced a couple more economists there, John Maynard Keynes and Paul Samuelson in particular. And just go back over the video when we finished, wind it back, have a look at that, make a note of it as well. These definitions are worth having. But the one I want to focus on today is Robbins' definition, because Robbins' definition is full of meaning. Economics is a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. Now, this is full of meaning. And what we're going to do is to look at this in more detail. These are the words we need to focus on in the definition. Economics, science, human behavior, ends, scarce means, and alternative uses. As we'll see, all of these have relevance in the context of our study of economics. So this is an important definition, and this is the one we're going to use. And this is the one that's used in colleges and universities throughout the world when we think of our type of economics, neoclassical economics. We start with economics is a science. Now, all of this is debatable. We'll come across people who will debate this. I would debate it and you would debate it later. And is it a science? Is it not a science? Is Robbins right? Is he wrong? this is not written in stone. This is not giving you a definitive answer. This is giving you something to think about. So let's look at economics as a science. Well, first of all, the type of economics we deal with is sometimes known as neoclassical economics. It's sometimes mixed up with mathematics, and we think of economics being mathematical or quantitative. And we analyze economic relationships using these type of mathematical expressions. I see that as shorthand. I don't think of it as economics. I think of when I write an equation down, that's shorthand. I could write it out in the English language, but it would be much longer. And perhaps I'm just lazy, but I would say that is shorthand to me. And I use it for that purpose, as does, I think, a lot of my colleagues. But neoclassical economics is what we're going to study. It attempts to use the scientific method. Having said that, there is no doubt we are attempting to generalize. And if we're attempting to generalize a relationship, if we see something depends on something else, we think, does it always depend on it? And as soon as we ask that question, we're thinking scientifically. So we need to be sure about what we mean here. What we do for a start is we postulate a relationship between two variables. They say that A depends on B. The quantity demanded for apples depends on the price of apples. A depends on B. The quantity of oranges depends on the price of oranges. It depends on other things as well, as we'll see. It depends on our income. It depends on fashion. It depends on health warnings. It depends on lots of things. But we'll just focus on price, since we're doing economics. So we say, we can postulate a relationship. We say the demand for shoes depends on the price of shoes. Or demand for a particular type of shoe depends on the price of that shoe. So we postulate a relationship between two variables, say the price and the quantity demanded. We could postulate a relationship between trends and fashions and the demand for fashion wear, for particular styles of clothing. So we're postulating a relationship. We're simply stating the relationship. That's what postulate means. Stating. We're stating a relationship. Next, we collect data. We've got the relationship. We've postulated the relationship. Now, let's collect some data and test it. Is it true, what we're saying? Is there a relationship between those two variables? Does the demand for apples depend on the price of apples? Or does it depend on what doctors are saying and the medical profession are saying about eating apples? Maybe it doesn't depend on the price. It depends on something else. We need to collect data and test it. Then we analyze the data to determine the relationship. We analyze it using perhaps some statistical method. We've got data. We've got the volume of sales versus the changes in the prices in different markets, and we can do things with that. We can analyze it. We can look at it, draw graphs, and just look at the data. Use techniques from statistics, perhaps. And once we've done that, we draw generalizations. We say, look, every time the price of apples increases, people buy less apples. Now we've generalized every time. And we'll come back to talk about this again in a few moments. But for the moment, we generalize. And that essentially is the scientific process that we go through. Let's look at an example. Every time the price of petrol rises, less petrol is sold. Okay, that's just a hypothesis. I haven't tested this. I'm just saying it. I'm just chatting to you. I'm just talking to you, and I'm saying, look, every time the price of petrol rises, less petrol is sold. Okay. Every time? Why every time? How do we know that it will happen every time? How do we know it will happen in the future? Can I see the future? No, I can't. So what gives me the right to say every time? Where am I getting that? Let's push on. There is something called the inductive method. Now, the inductive method is as follows. We state something, or we look at something called the principle of enumeration. What we do is we look at something that happens. The price of apples has increased. Now less apples are bought. Less apples are purchased. Okay, we can quantify that. The price of apples went up by 10% and the sale of apples fell by 20%. See, we've put it into numbers. Now we can quantify it. And this is we sometimes call the principle of enumeration. We're trying to enumerate. We're trying to count this. We're trying to measure it. So we're going to test the inductive method by enumeration, by counting, by analysis. And from that, we can generalize. We say, look, all the data we've got, every time the price of petrol rises, every time the price of petrol rises, less petrol is sold. Every time the price of apples rise, less apples are sold. Now we're generalizing every time. We've only observed it 4 or 5 times, maybe in our lives, but we tend to generalize. We think this is what happened in the past. We're going to watch out for this. This is the principle of enumeration. We're generalizing. We're going from some observation to saying every time. It's a big jump. Of course, what we're doing is we're relying on all of our family and friends and neighbours and everyone we come across who perhaps have the same experience. And after a while we think, look, we all agree upon this. Every time the price of apples rise, less apples are sold. We have induced this relationship. We have induced it. We've looked at what happens in practice, and out of this we have induced a principle. We've induced it by making observations. We've looked at it again and again and again, and every time it happens, and therefore we tend to say, look, we don't have to go around checking it all the time. It happens every time. Every time the price of something goes up, we buy less of it. Now we've induced that principle. So that's where we get our major proposition. Let's see how it works out. Let's go to, we have looked at the inductive method. Now, the inductive method has given us something like all A is B. Every time the price of apples increase, less apples are sold. Every time. Every time. Now, all A is B. Let's change it from apples to, say, petrol. It applies to everything. Every time the price of petrol rises, less petrol is sold. So, the price of apples, let's say, has increased, therefore less apples will be sold. Let's have a look. This case with petrol. Every time the price of petrol rises, less petrol is sold. Every time. And what that relationship looks like is the every time, well, all is every time. A, the price of petrol rises. B, less petrol is sold. So we've put into symbols here an ordinary English expression. Every time the price of petrol rises, less petrol is sold. And we've cast it as this expression. All A is B. All, every time. A, the price of petrol rises. B, less petrol is sold. So it's a shorthand way of doing it. Now, if we're told the price of petrol just rises, has just increased, if we're told that, we can conclude logically that therefore less apples are going to be sold. So we're using logic. This is Aristotle, or roughly Aristotle, Aristotelian way of thinking. All A is B. Major premise. A, therefore B. So if we start at the top, all A is B, we've induced that by making observations. We saw the price of apples and how it changed as the price changed. We watched it in many occasions, and our friends have watched it, and we've read about it. And after a while, we've induced every time the price of petrol rises, less petrol is sold. Price of apples rise, less apples are sold. Whatever it is. So now we've got this relationship. All A is B. Now we can deduce from that. We can say, look, the price of apples has just increased. Now what's going to happen? Well, we can conclude less apples are going to be sold. So we have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Which is all a very clever way of thinking. We have disagreements in economics, mostly because we're dealing with something very fundamental here. Economics is very important to mankind, and we should understand economics. We have disagreements as well. We have different people believing different things. The statements may be tested. Positive statements may be tested. If it's a positive statement, we say it's testable. Like, every time the price of apples rise, less apples will be sold. That's testable. We can go and get some data and test it. Does it work every time? Can we test it every time? Yes, we can. We get some data. It might be a problem to get the data. It might be a hassle, but we can get the data and we can test it. We can have different types of statement here. We can have positive statements, like all old age pensioners, if that's the right term for the elderly, receive a pension bonus of £1,000 every Christmas in the UK. That's a positive statement. It's positive, but it's not true. It's false, but it's a positive statement. It's testable. That's what we mean by positive statements. Positive statements may be tested. It doesn't mean they're true or false. It means they're testable. That's a positive statement. And we try to deal with positive statements, statements that can be testable. For example, go back to apples again. Every time the price of apples rise, less apples are sold. That's testable. We as the price of apples varies, we can test how many are sold. We can pick up the data, we can pick up the statistics, we can analyze it, we can draw graphs, we can do statistical analysis. It's testable. If it's testable, it's a positive statement. It doesn't matter how crazy the statement may sound, like the one I've got on the screen right now. All old age pensioners receive a pension bonus of £1,000 every Christmas. That's not true, but it's testable. It's untrue, but testable. We say it's a positive statement. It's positive because it's testable. There are two types of statement, positive, and there's another one which is not testable, which we'll come on to, which is normative. So positive statements may be tested. That's the point. Now, normative statements, these cannot be tested. I'll give you an example. The government ought to do something about road congestion. Well, that's my opinion. You can't test my opinion. It's just what I believe, or what somebody else believes. It's not testable. You can't test my imagination or my thoughts or my sentiments about the state of the roads. It's just my opinion. Somebody else may disagree with me. You may disagree with me and say, no, the roads are fine. Roads are great. I think, no, the roads are, something needs to be done about them. They need to be fixed. So we have an argument. We're arguing over normative statements. They're not testable. If they were testable, one of us would be proven wrong. The other one would be proven perhaps right on that statement. But we can't argue. We can't test it. It's normative. The government ought to do something about road congestion. It doesn't tell you anything. It just tells you my opinion about what the government's doing. But the government can say, no, I'm wrong. And the government has every right to say that, because it's just my opinion. It's a normative statement. It cannot be tested. It's a statement of opinion. So it doesn't mean anything. It's just my belief. It doesn't mean anything in the sense that anyone else can test it or we can operationalize it. It's my opinion. It's in my head. You've got opinions as well. I may agree with them or I may disagree with them. But they're just our thoughts. Let's look at human behavior. In the definition, the Robbins definition, it says economics is a science which studies human behavior. Well, therefore we can say it's very, very faint. I realize my slide here needs a bit of work, but economics is a social science. It's human behavior, so it's a social science. I'm sorry about the writing on that slide. It says, if you can't read it, it says, therefore economics is a social science. Okay, so economics is a science, it studies human behavior, and therefore it is a social science. It's not a natural science like physics or biology or chemistry. It's dealing with our opinions. These ones, you can test a hypothesis. Physicists perform experiments, and the experiments are nothing to do with the physicist's opinions. They are experiments that the outcome is the way nature is. So the natural sciences are composed of disciplines like physics, biology, chemistry, all the so-called harder sciences. Now, the relationships are more complex when we're dealing with people. We have a tougher job in many respects. Economists are dealing with psychological and cultural variables, and these are defined modelling. We're dealing with people, and people change all the time and have different opinions, and people are people. That's what it's nice to be like to be a human, because you talk to the same person twice on the same topic and get different conclusions, different perspectives. It's what it's like to be a human. So we are different. Natural science and the social sciences. We are distinctly different. In general, we have more variables to consider than the natural sciences. Natural sciences, they control a certain number of variables to perform the experiment, to make sure that certain things do not impinge on the experiment. We are dealing with people. People are extremely complex. And we're all inconsistent. We change our opinions and we change the way we live and we change our ideas, and so we are difficult to deal with. So the object of study in the social sciences is man, and we're more complex than the natural sciences. In fact, we are perverse. That sounds a bit strong, but we are perverse in a way because we don't like to be predictable. Being predictable, it sounds an insult. It sounds like, oh, you're a very predictable person. It sounds like I'm insulting you. If I say you're a predictable person, or I'm predictable, it normally has a connotation that I'm boring. I'm a boring person. I like to think I'm not boring. So that's the contrast between the natural and the social sciences. Now, there is a group of economists called the Austrians. They're quite controversial in many respects, but they've come up with a lot of interesting questions. They consider man far too complex to be modelled mathematically. They're totally opposed to everything we're going to do. And if you have a chance, I'd strongly recommend you look up online Austrian economics and do some reading into the subject. You'll get a totally different perspective, and a very interesting perspective as well. So we have to give them credit for shedding light on a problem that the approach that we're going to take has inherent. It's built into it. We have a problem. The problem is essentially you and I. We are not things. We are human, and we are capable of making crazy decisions and changing our behavior and being unpredictable. Whereas a particle in a laboratory with a scientist, that particle will operate according to the nature of the thing, the nature of the particle, the nature of the experiment. This experiment does not set out to upset the scientist. In economics, we get changes all the time. What sometimes we do in economics is we make an assumption in Latin, everything else being constant, ceteris paribus. And ceteris paribus means, look, we've got lots of variables here. We're dealing with people like you and I, and we are complex. What determines my demand for bread? Well, lots of things. My income, the price of bread, how far the shop is away, the convenience of buying the bread, the style of the bread, the look of the bread, medical reports about eating bread, the alternatives, whatever they are, potato and whatever, French fries or whatever, rice, we could have rice instead of bread, whatever. So there's a lot of things to be taken into account when you go to buy bread. Buying bread is complicated, but so is everything else. So what we do is we hold all of those constant. We say, look, today I'm going to buy bread. I'm going to focus on the bread. So I go to the shop and I think, oh, the price of bread's gone up. It's increased dramatically. Maybe I won't buy it. Maybe that's too expensive. I'll buy something else. I'll buy some rice. So ceteris paribus is when we're holding everything else constant. We're saying our decision is dependent entirely upon the price, or our decision is dependent entirely upon our income, holding everything else constant. So we must specify that. Bear this in mind. We're coming back to it later on. That's the Robbins definition. We've got as far as ends and scarce means. We've looked at human behavior. Let's look at ends and scarce means. Ends are just our wants. This is what we want. The ends of my activity is to produce my own welfare, to produce, in very crude terms, produce some money, which I will convert into goods and services that I want to purchase. And that's why I might want to work or do things. We have a lot to talk about with money and what is money and so on. We'll ignore all of those issues for the moment. I'm just saying that the ends of economic activity is to satisfy wants. That's why we do what we do. We have a want. Sometimes we're not aware of the want. The want is almost created for us by perhaps advertising or by lifestyles. My neighbours have got a new car, therefore I want a new car. So I now have to work harder to get a new car. I don't know, I'm just saying there are lots of influences in what we want. It's not a simple, straightforward, I wanted. It must be determined by something else. The means are the ways we satisfy our wants. And that's important. Wants lead to our demands for goods, but wants are psychological. They're in our head. Clearly, if it's for food and we're hungry, you could say it's not in our head, although the sensation of hunger will be in our head. It's not in our stomach, it's in our head. But by and large, our wants are determined by psychological issues. And that's why they're open to influence by, for example, marketing and advertising and promotions and what your neighbours are doing and So our wants may be seen as broadly psychological. We have biological wants. We have shelter. We want food and we want shelter, but we also want, in our society, luxury goods. We're influenced by marketing and by advertising, repetitive advertising. We want the latest style of clothing and the latest car and the latest holiday and the latest whatever it is that's fashionable. We were influenced by this because these are, in a sense, creating wants or altering our wants and turning our wants around. Over time, fashions and society do change us. And the pressures to conform are broadly related to the activities of the advertising and promotions industry. But that's the way we live. That's something we have to take on board. There's also cultural issues. For example, the satisfaction of some wants may generate new wants. If I purchase a house, I'll probably need to purchase furniture. There's no point having a house and nowhere to sit. So we buy furniture as well. But also, if our neighbours buy something, we might buy it as well. Or buy an even better version to make them feel bad. There is a culture, there is a family and neighbourhood effect that kicks in when we go purchasing as well. And these are all dealt with in the module on marketing. So these are not quintessentially economics. So we'll just mention them and move on. Scarcity is one of the truly big issues that economics deals with. And it deserves its own set of classes and videos. So watch out for these. These are going to come. I'm not going to deal with it in any great detail here. This is a big topic. And there will be separate classes on this. So watch out for it. So means, well, the means is what we do, how we turn raw materials into goods and services that we can consume. And that comes under production. There is also a set of classes and videos on production, which we'll make available, and you will deal with those there. So I'm not going to stretch out this one much further than I have to. I've already gone way over half an hour on this particular class, which is, for a video, is extremely long. So I will make those available elsewhere. Choice, we need to just have a quick word about. Alternative uses introduces the problem of choice. So when we have alternative uses, we have a problem of choice. Which one do we pick? So very briefly, we need to make choices, and what determines those choices, that's an issue, as I said, we will make available in the other classes, the other videos. But economics poses three questions. What goods and services should be produced? How should the goods and services be produced? And for whom should the goods and services be produced? And that is, it's important that we look at how these are dealt with. And again, as I said, the subject matter of further videos. The production possibility frontier. Well, this is an interesting one that fits in here. And again, I'm worried about the time of this video, but the production possibility frontier is the frontier which shows the output possibles from the most efficient use of the factors of production. So imagine, for example, we're going to produce guns or butter. This is a very famous example in economics. Now, guns and butter, we can produce so many guns and so many units of butter. And the table here tells us what we can have. If we produce one gun, we can have 21 units of butter. If we have two guns, we have to cut down on the amount of butter. We can't have more of each. The more of one, the less of the other. Which means we're looking at a curve like that. And this is called a production possibility frontier. In this case, between guns and butter. Very famous example. We could have, at the point H, we can produce that because we have enough resources to produce that many guns and butter. But we cannot produce I. I is outside of our production possibility. In other words, at H, we can produce more guns and the same amount of butter, or more butter and the same amount of guns. So if it's 4 and 15, we could move to 3 and 18, just as an example. That's possible, perhaps, from this curve. We'd have to read it off. And that's really all I want to do with this one. I'm sorry the video has gone on for far too long, but it is a very important video. I will be breaking it down into different sections, and you'll get all of these done differently as smaller sections as you work through the various courses. But this one is an elaborate one. It's around 36 minutes, I calculate. So we'll leave it at that and say thank you for watching.